The first time I heard Subject B speak, it was like listening to a ghost whisper secrets it had no right to know. We were running separate trials to isolated chambers, to participants, zero contact. The study was simple: integrate artificial memory modules into the subconscious and observe the neural adaptations. No shared networks, no overlapping data streams, just two minds sealed away from each other, building new pasts in the dark. Then, Subject B started remembering things he shouldn't, not vague impressions, not hazy deja vu, sharp, intimate details, names of childhood pets, the smell of rain on a specific street in a town he'd never visited, the exact weight of a blue wool blanket his hands had never touched. He described them with the ease of someone flipping through an old photo album. And when we pressed him, his confusion was genuine. Of course, these were his memories. Why were we asking? We tore the systems apart, checked every line of code, every firewall, every failsafe. There was no leak, no crossover, no possible way for Subject A's memories to bleed into Subject B's mind. But the more we listened, the more the impossible became undeniable. Then came the moment that unraveled everything. Subject B was mid-sentence, recounting a summer afternoon, a lake, a wooden dock, the way the sunlight fractured on the water when he paused. His voice softened, almost hesitant. Does your wedding ring still have the inscription? The room froze. No one knew about that. Not the researchers, not the texts, not the files, just me and her. The words that followed were in a language we'd invented together, a private cipher of love and inside jokes. He recited them perfectly, not close, not almost exact. That's when I understood. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't science. This was something else, something that shouldn't exist. How do you look into the eyes of a stranger and see your own life staring back? How do you stand in a room where the walls between minds have crumbled, where memories, those sacred, solitary things, have become shared without consent? I never met him, but he remembers the way my wife's laughter sounds when she's trying not to cry. He remembers the scar on my knee from a bicycle accident when I was 9. He remembers the last thing my father said to me before the funeral. And I don't know which is more terrifying, that his memories are mine, or that mine might not belong to me at all. The first time I heard Subject B speak in my voice, I thought it was a glitch, a misfire in the audio feed, a technician's mistake. But then he said my grandmother's name, Leora, with the same soft inflection she used when scolding me for stealing apricots from her garden, a name I had never spoken aloud in the lab, a name buried in private files, encrypted behind layers of clearance. We were supposed to be running a simple memory integration study, two subjects to isolated chambers, no shared stimuli, no overlapping data streams, just neural mapping and recall exercises. Subject a volunteer from Oslo with no prior connection to the project. Subject be a man from Buenos Aires who had never left South America. Their lives should have been parallel lines, never touching, never bending toward one another. But then Subject B started remembering things that weren't his. It began with small things, a description of a red tricycle with a bent wheel, the smell of burnt toast in a kitchen with yellow curtains, fragments scattered like debris. At first, we dismissed it as confabulation, the brain stitching together false narratives from stray signals. But the details grew sharper, more precise. He spoke of a storm in the Czech countryside, of hiding under a wooden desk as hail shattered the windows. Subject: I had lived that storm. I knew because I had read her file. I had seen the scar on her knee from where the splinter would cut her dot, and then Subject B turned his head toward the observation glass toward me and asked if my wedding ring still had the inscription. The air left my lungs. No one knew about the inscription, not my colleagues, not the project leads. It was a private joke between my wife and me, a phrase in a dialect so obscure even translators stumbled over it. Yet there it was, spilling from Subject B's lips like a secret he'd carried for years. Word for word, syllable for syllable, the room tilted. I gripped the edge of the console, my wedding band pressing cold against my skin. Data leakage was impossible. The systems were air-gapped, the protocols flawless. There was no way he could have accessed my memories, no way he could have known, unless they weren't mine to begin with. The rest of the session blurred into static. My hands moved on autopilot, logging timestamps, flagging anomalies, but my mind was elsewhere, dredging up old philosophy lectures about consciousness, about the illusion of self. If a memory could exist outside the mind that formed it, what did that make me? A vessel, a receiver, or just another subject in someone else's experiment? By the time I left the lab, the sky had darkened into bruised purples. I stood in the parking lot, staring at my reflection in the car window, half expecting to see another face staring back. The inscription on my ring caught the street light, the letters winking as if sharing a joke I no longer understood. That night, I dreamt of a child's hands digging in wet soil. I couldn't tell if they were mine. And when I woke, the taste of apricots lingered on my tongue. The first time Subject B spoke of my childhood, I laughed, not out of amusement, but reflex, the kind of laugh that claws its way out of your throat when reality tilts just enough to make you question your grip on it. You used to hide under the oak tree during storms, he had said, his voice steady, matter of fact. Not because you were afraid, because you liked how the roots cradled you. Like arms. I had never told anyone that, not even my wife. The lab was sterile, all white walls and flickering fluorescence. But in that moment, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My pen froze mid-sentence on the observation log. Data leakage was the obvious answer, a corrupted file, a mislabeled recording. But the protocols were airtight. Subject A and Subject B had never been in the same room, never accessed the same systems, never even breathed the same air. Their studies ran parallel to isolated threads in a tightly controlled experiment. Yet here was Subject B, recounting my life like it was his own. At first, it was small things. The scar on my left knee from a bicycle accident at age 7. The way my mother hummed a lullaby in a language so old even she didn't know the words. Details so intimate they shouldn't have existed outside my own skull. I combed through every line of code, every firewall, every backup drive. Nothing, no breach, no overlap. Then came the wedding ring. Does it still say Alba y Ovido inside the band? Subject B asked one evening, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as if reading the words from the tiles. You chose it because it sounded like a poem. But she was the one who laughed and said it was morbid. My hand instinctively closed around the ring. Alba y Olvido, dawn and oblivion, a private joke between my wife and me, etched in a dialect we'd made up as teenagers. No records existed of it, no photos of the inscription. It was ours, only ours. And yet, the implications were a slow creeping horror. If it wasn't data leakage, then what? Shared consciousness? Quantum entanglement of memory? I buried myself in research, chasing theories that dissolved like smoke the moment I grasped them. Meanwhile, Subject B grew more certain, more possessive. "They're mine," he insisted whenever I pressed him. I remember the weight of the blanket my grandmother knit. I remember the smell of her lavender soap. I remember, but they weren't his memories. They were mine. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. Rain tapped against the lab windows, like fingers begging to be let in. Subject B, usually calm, suddenly sat upright, his face twisting with something like grief. "You never went back," he whispered, "after the funeral. You couldn't bear to see the empty chair." I hadn't. After my father died, I donated his things, sold the house, erased every trace. The chair, a worn-out recliner that had molded to his shape over decades, was the one thing I couldn't face. I had left it behind without a second glance. No one knew that. Not even my wife. That was the moment the ground gave way beneath me. Not because of the impossibility of it, but because of the intimacy. Subject he wasn't just recalling facts. He was reliving my emotions, my regrets, the quiet shamus I'd buried so deep I'd forgotten their weight. What does it mean to be known, truly known by someone you've never met? What does it mean when the walls between minds turn out to be illusions? I still don't have answers. Only questions that coil tighter the more I pull at them. But this much is certain. Memory is not a record. It's a story we tell ourselves. And somewhere, in some unfathomable way, Subject B is telling mine. The experiment was supposed to be about integration. Instead, it became a mirror, and in its reflection, I'm no longer sure which one of us is real. The first time Subject B described my childhood bedroom, I laughed. Not out of amusement, but because the alternative was screaming. The walls, he said, were the color of faded mint, the kind that loses its vibrancy after too many summers. There was a crack in the ceiling shaped like a question mark, and if you pressed your ear to the floor at night, you could hear the neighbor's dog whining through the vents. All of it was true, every detail, and none of it should have been possible. We had been meticulous, two subjects, two facilities, two separate teams, no shared networks, no overlapping personnel, no accidental encounters in hallways. The study was simple: integrate artificial memory modules into isolated neural frameworks and observe how the mind adapted. But somewhere in the sterile silence of controlled environments, something had gone terribly, beautifully wrong. Subject he didn't just recall my memories, he lived them. He spoke about the time I'd fallen off my bike at 7 years old, the way the gravel had bitten into my knees, the metallic taste of blood mixing with the salt of tears. He remembered the exact shade of my mother's scarf when she bandaged the wound, burnt orange, threadbare at the edges. When I asked him how he knew, his answer was a quiet devastation. Because it happened to me. The team called it contamination, a breach in protocol, a failure of firewalls. But data doesn't bleed. It doesn't seep through walls or slip between locked doors. We tore apart the systems, traced every line of code, and found nothing. No leaks, no cross-contamination, just two minds that should have been strangers. now tangled in a way that defied every law of science. Then came the wedding ring. I never took it off. Not after the accident. Not after the funeral. It was the last piece of her I had left, the weight of it a constant reminder of the life we'd built. No one knew about the inscription inside. No one could have known. We'd made it up in the back of a diner at 3 a.m., her laughter warm against my shoulder as she scribbled nonsense words onto a napkin, a secret language for love too big for ordinary words. When Subject He mentioned it, my world cracked open. Does it still say it? He'd asked, his voice eerily soft, the words inside the band. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. He closed his eyes, reciting them perfectly, the silly, sacred phrase that had never existed outside of that diner booth and the quiet of our bedroom. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a glitch somewhere in the uncharted depths of memory, in the spaces between neurons and electricity. Subject B and I had become entwined, not through files or wires, but through something far more terrifying, something that looked, for all the world, like soul. The implications were unbearable. If memories could cross voids without contact, without reason, then what else was possible? Were we ever truly separate, or were we all just fragments of a larger consciousness, occasionally brushing against each other in the dark? By the time the study was terminated, I no longer cared about the science. All I knew was this: somewhere in the world there was a man who remembered my wife's voice better than I did. And I had never even met him. The human mind is a vast and lonely place, but sometimes, just sometimes, it echoes. The first time Subject He mentioned the oak tree, I nearly dropped my coffee. Not just any oak tree, the oak tree. The one with the gnarled roots that twisted like old veins, the one that stood at the edge of my grandmother's property where I'd carved my initials at 7 years old. A place I hadn't thought of in decades. A place he should never have known existed. But he did, and he described it in perfect, aching detail, the way the bark felt under his fingers, the exact shade of green the leaves turned in late summer, even the rusty swing chain that used to creak in the wind. His memories, he called them. The study was supposed to be clean, isolated, to subjects, to chambers, to separate streams of data. No overlap, no contamination, just two minds navigating their own fragmented recollections, stitching together pieces of lives they'd lived. Except somehow, Subject T was stitching together mine. At first, we assumed a breach, a glitch in the system, a crossed wire, a file corrupted in transfer, but the text tore the system apart and found nothing. No leaks, no shared servers, no way for Subject B to access my past. And yet he kept remembering, not just places, not just things, but moments. The time I sprained my ankle running from a neighbor's dog, the way my father's voice cracked when he told me my mother was gone. Private, intimate shards of a life he'd never touched. And then came the ring. I never took it off. A simple band worn smooth by years, with an inscription inside, a phrase my wife and I had whispered to each other in the dark. A secret, a vow, and a language we'd made up together. Subject be asked about it during a routine debrief. Does it still say what you carved inside? My blood turned to ice. He shouldn't have known there was an inscription. He shouldn't have known the words. He shouldn't have known anything. But he did. And when I pressed him, voice shaking, hands clenched, he just smiled. A sad, distant thing, I remember how it felt when you put it on for the first time, cold, heavy, like a promise. That was the moment the world split open. Because he was right. The study wasn't about memory integration. Not really. It was about boundaries, about where one mind ended and another began. But Subject B had crossed a line we didn't even know existed, and with every passing day, his recollections of my life grew sharper, more vivid, as if they were his own. I started dreaming his memories in return, a childhood home I'd never seen, a sister's laugh I'd never heard, a name, Lena, that clung to my tongue like a ghost. We were never supposed to meet, never supposed to overlap, but somewhere in the dark corners of consciousness, we already had. The question wasn't how. It was why. Why him? Why me? Why these memories? These fragile, fleeting pieces of a past that didn't belong to him? The answer came too late. Subject B's final entry was a single sentence. I think I was you before you were. And then silence. They found him sitting exactly where he'd been left. Eyes open, pulse steady. But whatever had been him was gone. Just an empty shell, breathing but not alive. I quit the study that night, but I still hear his voice sometimes. In the rustle of leaves, in the hum of old recordings, in the quiet before sleep, when the line between memory and reality blurs. Maybe we were never separate. Maybe we were always meant to collide. Or maybe, just maybe, some memories are too strong to stay where they belong. The room was too quiet when I finally played back the recording, just the hum of the old ventilation system and the faint crackle of the audio file. Subject B's voice, calm and certain, describing the inscription inside my wedding ring. The words were precise, intimate, a private joke between my wife and me, carved into metal, pressed against my skin for years, a secret that had never left the two of us until now. Until him, I had spent weeks combing through data logs, firewalls, transfer protocols, anything that could explain how memories that belonged exclusively to me had seeped into the mind of a man I'd never met. There were no breaches, no overlaps in the study's design, no way for Subject B to have accessed my life, my past, the fragile moments I'd tucked away like keepsakes in a locked drawer. And yet there they were, my memories, alive in his voice, recounted with the ease of someone who had lived them firsthand. The implications coiled around my throat like cold fingers. If memories could migrate without contact, without explanation, then what were they really? Were they ours to begin with, or just fragments drifting through some unseen current, waiting to be caught by another mind? The thought was vertigo-inducing. I had built my career on the certainty that memory was a fixed point, a personal archive. Now the ground beneath that belief had fissured, and I was staring into the abyss of something I couldn't name. Then came the question that unraveled me completely. Subject B, in one of his final sessions, had paused mid-sentence, his brow furrowing as if straining to hear a distant sound. "Do you still wake up at 3:17 a.m.? He'd asked every night, like clockwork. You never know why. My breath had stalled. It was true. A habit or a curse I'd never disclosed to anyone, not even my wife. There was no record of it, no possible way for him to know. And yet he did. The study was shut down shortly after. Officially, it was labeled inconclusive. Unofficially, it was buried. Too many questions. to few answers that wouldn't shake the foundations of what we thought we knew about consciousness. But in the silence that followed, I couldn't escape the haunting truth. Subject, he hadn't just accessed my memories. He had lived them, felt them, carried their weight as if they'd always been his. And that left me with a terror far deeper than data leakage or scientific anomalies. What if we're all just vessels? What if the moments we cling to, the first kiss, the childhood home, the whispered promises in the dark, aren't truly ours, but echoes passing through us, transient and borrowed? The idea that memory might be fluid, inured from the self, is a loneliness I still can't shake. Because if even our past isn't ours to keep, then what in this vast and indifferent universe ever really is? I never met Subject, not face to face, not in any way that should have mattered. And yet he knew me in ways no one else ever has. He remembered the scent of my grandmother's perfume, the exact shade of the wallpaper in my first apartment, the way my chest ached the night before I left home for good. He carried these things inside him, not as stories he'd heard, but as his own, as truth.